Hi, everyone. Welcome to Science Friday with the Trustees. I'm Molly, the island's education manager here on Martha's Vineyard. The Trustees is Massachusetts' largest nonprofit conservation and preservation organization with 118 properties throughout the Commonwealth. For today's lesson, we will be studying fish migration. This lesson is designed for high school students, so grades 9 through 12, but should be enjoyed by all ages and adults as well. So for this lesson, each student should have just a piece of paper and a pencil, and that is all that you will need today. Okay, so let's dive right in with fish migration. So what is fish migration? In general, migration is a movement at a certain life history stage, so a certain stage of someone's life or a species' life, by the majority of the population for a particular purpose. Today, we're talking about and studying fish migration in particular. So in fish, sometimes the needs of a population cannot be met by a single habitat. So then the fitness of individual fish or the health of individual fish benefits from moving to an alternative habitat or an alternative environment. So you'll see on your screen, there are three big words. We're going to slowly go through each word, what they mean, and what types of fish migration fall under each category. So the first one we're going to be studying are diadromous migrations. Looking at this red arrow, can you guess what type of fish migration this is? What habitat or environment fish are moving from and going to, or vice versa? So diadromous migration. This is a category of fish migration where all species cross the seawater and freshwater boundary. That's the main thing to take note of. Diadromous migration is taking place between seawater and freshwater. And we're going to go through examples of this migration where it may start in seawater and go to freshwater, this fish species, or vice versa. So a few things to take note of with diadromous migration. It's a migration that occurs regularly. It's a physiological mediated movement between two biomes. So biomes as in habitats such as freshwater or marine environments. And it's a movement between those two environments. There's usually predictable timing of this migration, and it's taking place during a stage, a life history phase, or a stage in that fish's life where it needs to move to a new environment in order to reproduce or spawn, most likely, or to feed. This diadromous migration involves the majority of a species population. It's usually obligatory, which just means that it needs to happen. And it occurs in opposite directions. So keep in mind, diadromous migration is occurring between freshwater and saltwater, between those two boundaries. So within the category of diadromous migration, we have three subcategories. You can mark this down on your note-taking sheet. So we have diadromy, and under diadromy, the first type of migration we're going to study is anadromy. So anadromy is birth in freshwater of that fish, feeding and growth at sea, and then back to freshwater in order to spawn or reproduce. A great example of an anadromous species would be a salmon. Most of us are familiar with salmon. We've eaten salmon before, but we think about the Pacific Northwest salmon, and up in Alaska, they're going to be born in freshwater, these freshwater rivers and streams, head out to the ocean once they're old enough and big enough for feeding and growth at sea, and then go back to that same river and stream, which is pretty amazing, in order to reproduce, and then the life cycle starts over again. So anadromy. And later in the lesson, we will be studying one local species that is local to Martha's Vineyard and the northeast part of the US that is an anadromous fish. Okay, next we have catadromy. So catadromy is the exact opposite of anadromy. That's the main thing to remember. Catadromy is the fish is born in saltwater, heads to the freshwater as a juvenile, and then back to the saltwater in order to spawn and reproduce when it's an adult. So an example of a catadromous fish would be an eel. So again, this is the exact opposite of anadromy. Born in saltwater, goes to freshwater, and then back to the saltwater. Okay, next, the third one under our diadromous species or type of fish migration is amphidromy. Amphidromy is a less common type of life cycle for fish. It's mainly present in the tropics and subtropics, so we're not really finding that in our local species here. But this type of migration occurs with freshwater spawning, so freshwater reproduction, then the ocean larvae stage. So the larvae, what I'm circling here, will spend their time in seawater or the marine environment. And then as this larvae grows to a juvenile stage and getting older, it heads back to estuary into freshwater. And then most of its life, or all of its life from there, is spent in freshwater. So it really just has a small stint, this one part of its life cycle in the marine environment. Okay, so those are our three types or subcategories of diadromous fish migration. Gone through diadromous, remember fresh to saltwater or vice versa. Next, let's take a look at these two types of migration. We have Potamodromous and oceanodromous migrations. So the first one, Potamodromy. This is a purely freshwater life cycle. That's the main thing you need to remember. The fish's entire life is just spent in freshwater. Some of the movement, there will be movement within that freshwater environment, as you're seeing in this life cycle image from downstream to upstream. Often these fish, like trout, river trout or brook trout, will be moving from one part or one environment of its freshwater area to another. And it could be an upstream environment that's going to be more protected for its eggs when it goes to spawn or something like that. So we have Potamodromy, the freshwater life cycle for fish migration. And then oceanodromy. So this, just the exact opposite of Potamodromy, is a purely marine life cycle. Often when we think about fish, this is probably what we're assuming. When we think of fish or saltwater fish, we're thinking they're spending their whole life, their entirety of life in saltwater. So this would be the case with white sharks, for example, or tuna, where they will just spend their life in the marine environment. Okay, we'll take a break right now so you can answer these two questions. So on your sheet of paper, the first question I want you to answer is this one. Which type of fish migration is spawning or reproducing in freshwater with life spent at sea? So think back to our diadromous fish migration, because remember, diadromy is the movement between the saltwater and freshwater boundary. So we're looking at spawning in freshwater and then life in the sea or a marine environment. So choose one. Within those diadromous types of fish migration, we have anadromy, catadromy, amphidromy. And then our second question, please list an example of a catadromous species. So think back, what is catadromy? You may have to, and that is fine, to rewind the video a little bit if you need to take a look back on those slides. But hopefully you also took some notes that you can refer to. So list an example of a catadromous species. So our next question is, why do fish migrate? It's a valid question, right? There are quite a few migration triggers for fish. And we touched on that a little bit when we were talking about diadromous migration at the beginning of the lesson. But there are two different types of migration triggers, and we're going to talk about that next. We have internal triggers and external triggers. So endogenous and exogenous triggers. So the first ones are endogenous triggers. These are, think of that word endo, that internal trigger. So what's happening inside that fish that is causing it to migrate or letting it know it needs to migrate now? So this is really seen at a genetic level, at a physiological level, based on size and growth or osmoregulation. So let's think about these for a second. Size and growth. The fish goes from a larval stage to a juvenile stage and is getting bigger. That can simply be its trigger. When it reaches a certain size and a certain part of its life stage, it will migrate. Osmoregulation is simply a way for fish, in order to survive in a freshwater or saltwater environment. So again, we talked about the salmon. Salmon, they're able to osmoregulate where they can support saltwater because they're born in freshwater. When they are able to osmoregulate, that means that they can be living in that saltwater environment, and that's important. So simply put, to remember, these endogenous triggers are the internal, real genetic, physical triggers of that fish that cause it to migrate. So next we have exogenous triggers. So exo, opposite of endo, internal, exo, external, exo. So external triggers would be fish density. Take a look at the salmon here. There's lots of them. They're all trying to head upstream to their river spawning environment. A lot of fish, that means more competition. So if there are a lot of fish in one environment and one area, that can be a trigger to some of that population that it needs to move in order to have enough food. So food abundance is a big part of these exogenous triggers as well. As they move from one environment to another, fish a lot of the time will be following food, and that is a trigger as food, so smaller species of fish that the bigger fish are eating, for example, move to a different area, those fish start to follow them. Water flows are a trigger, like when we're thinking about salmon. Temperature and photoperiod. So temperature, as we move through our seasons, we have seasonal migrations of fish. And we're going to talk about that next as we get into one specific species in particular. And photoperiod, so the amount of sunlight that's happening, and that ties into our seasonal triggers. So when we go from winter to spring, we see a ton of spring migrations here in the northeast of the US. And that spring migration really ties into fish, birds, all sorts of species. So when you go outside in your yard now and looking out in the ocean and you're going fishing, this is the time of year that we're realizing that these species are arriving here to our local water, our local forests, and so on. So of course, with migration, there are quite a few costs and benefits. Because as we said earlier, migration, the point of migration is for a fish to increase its fitness level. So that means its health, and it's able to give itself, a better chance at survival if it's moving to a new environment. So the costs to migration, they can be quite high, a high energy expenditure. If a fish is traveling very far to move to a whole new environment, they're using up a lot of energy. There's also risk involved, of course. With that amount of travel, you could have mortality. You're getting to new environments with new predators, and there's greater chance of death for that fish. But there are benefits, and that's why fish continue to migrate on generally a yearly basis or seasonal basis. Release from competition. So if we think back, if there's lots of fish all together, there's not a lot of food in that area. If you move away from those other fish friends, you're releasing yourself from that competition and able to go out and find some new resources for yourself. You can improve those feeding opportunities, which ties into that, and increase size and fertility, which also ties into being able to find more food and so on. Okay, so let's take another break now and answer these questions. What is one example of an external or exogenous trigger for fish migration? And second question, why do fish migrate? So take a few minutes to answer those questions. You can hit pause on your video in order to make sure you're able to jot down the answers that you have. Okay, so for the next part of our lesson, we are going to be looking at one fish in particular, the striped bass. The range of the striped bass is seen here on this map from Canada down to Florida. So here on the northeast side of the US and down to the Gulf of Mexico. The striped bass is a long-lived species. It can live up to 30 years and they can get quite large as well. You'll see some striped bass in this photo here on your screen. So the striped bass is an anadromous species. Do you remember what anadromy is when it comes to fish migration? This means the striped bass spawns in freshwater, lives its life out at sea in a marine environment, and then heads back to freshwater, so rivers and estuaries, fresh and brackish water, to then reproduce again. So let's take a close look at the striped bass food chain as we start to learn further in the lesson about why striped bass migrate. We want to understand what striped bass are eating and why. So striped bass are opportunistic predators. So they'll feed on lots of things, but in general, a larger striped bass will feed on squid, crabs, and smaller bait fish or forage fish. So here around Martha's Vineyard, especially in the spring, we have herring coming in on herring runs and in rivers, and striped bass are following those smaller forage bait fish like herring or menhaden, like pictured here. So it's important that we understand striped bass are eating these species and they're getting energy from this food source. Then what are the squid, crabs, and smaller forage fish eating? Because this all relates up the food chain back to the striped bass. So next we have zooplankton. Zooplankton, these are smaller marine species like krill that you're seeing here, or copepods. And then the zooplankton are eating phytoplankton. Phytoplankton is at the base of our food chain here and is really the base of the entire marine environment food chain. This is what is causing primary productivity, and it's that base layer of the marine food web. So phytoplankton, we can't see them with our eyes. You have to look through a microscope in order to see them. They're tiny plant-like organisms, marine algae. They live generally near the surface of the ocean or where there's lots of upwelling, like closer to shore as well. So phytoplankton get their energy from the sun to make their food. So if we know where to find phytoplankton, then we potentially know where to find zooplankton. And if we know where to find zooplankton, we can gain some insights of where the squid, crabs, and bait fish are, like menhaden. And then finally, where the striped bass are. And this is important to keep in mind. So striped bass, they migrate. They're anadromous fish. They migrate north during the summer and south during the winter. Can you guess why these fish would take or choose that migratory path to go from here? I'm pointing to where Martha's Vineyard and Cape Cod is, south in the winter, and then back north in the summer. Let's think back to our migration triggers. And we're going to be looking at two of these migration triggers where it relates to striped bass. First one is temperature. So this map here is showing sea surface temperature from April 14th here in the Northwest Atlantic, so off the northeast coast of the United States. So you'll see on the right here, we have our scale showing us the temperature. And as it goes lighter in color up towards the yellows, orange, and reds, it's getting warmer. And the cooler colors are obviously cooler. So we're seeing here April 14th around us here in Massachusetts and on Martha's Vineyard. We're in this blue shade around 45, 46 degrees Fahrenheit, maybe even a little bit lower, so 6 degrees Celsius. And this is the sea surface temperature. If we look further south, we're seeing warmer temperatures, quite a bit of warmth right here up into the 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So when we think about striped bass like to live in certain temperatures. So they have a temperature preference. We don't know fully, we don't have a clear picture of the exact temperature preference, but in general, we assume that striped bass like to live in 55 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit water in general. So 13 to 18 degrees Celsius, somewhere within that range. So as we go through these slides, we're going to keep that in mind. Remember 55 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit. So we've talked about temperature as a trigger for striped bass. Now let's think about food abundance. So I brought that up earlier with migration triggers, that the amount of food in an area is going to cause that fish to move potentially to a new area if there's not enough food, or if the food is moving to follow that food. So one sneaky way we can think about food here in the marine environment is looking at chlorophyll A. This may be a new term for many of you, but let's bring it back to our word food. Chlorophyll A is a representation in the water of the amount of phytoplankton. Sometimes it's not as cut and dry as this, but for this lesson, we are going to use chlorophyll A as an example of the amount of phytoplankton in the water. So remember, Phytoplankton is at the base of that striped bass food web, food chain. So where that phytoplankton is may mean as we go up, that's where the striped bass are or where they are trying to go. So chlorophyll A, simply we want to know chlorophyll A is food. And this map is a satellite image showing the amount of chlorophyll A in the water. Since this is a satellite image, you're getting cloud cover, so you're not getting a clear picture of everywhere, but in general, where are we seeing more chlorophyll A or phytoplankton or food? As we go up the scale bar, the further yellow, orange, red is higher densities, higher amounts of that chlorophyll. So again, here's Martha's Vineyard up here in Nantucket and Cape Cod. Look at all of this red. And then along in here in the shore is where we're seeing quite a bit of red. So keep that in mind. So now I want to ask you, and let's look closely at these two maps. So where are the striped bass in April versus July? So this is from April 14th, and I've put a black box here to show, again, so we can keep in mind that range of the striped bass temperature preference, 55 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit or so. So we're looking for these colors, sort of a turquoisey getting to yellow color. So take a look at this map. Where are the striped bass in April? If you follow my cursor, the colors seem to be generally down here, right? We're not seeing that color up in this region yet, just down here. And if we think about striped bass, where they're going to reproduce are rivers and estuaries and bays. So they'll be heading up into these areas. And the colors that we're seeing of the sea surface temperature coincide with the temperature the striped bass like to be living in and prefer. So when we compare to July, so height of summer, the water is getting warmer. This area, so we were over in here before, look at this color now. This is very red, very dark. If we think of the striped bass range as here, they are not going to want to be living in these temperatures. So the striped bass, where do you think they are in July? Let's look at our colors up in here, especially as we get around Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket and Cape Cod. Up in this range is where we are starting to see the striped bass. So this temperature change is more or less pushing them further north. As the water gets warmer, that is their trigger to head north in the summer months. So now let's look at temperature and food. So sea surface temperature and our chlorophyll is that representation of food for the striped bass. So is there food where you think the striped bass are? Take a look at this map and remember the striped bass range and decide for yourself, is there food, is there chlorophyll A? And this was a satellite image taken in April, and this is the sea surface temperature in April as well. Is there food in that same region? So we're looking, the striped bass would be around in here, these turquoisey colors. And let's see, is there high amounts of food? We're looking for those reds. And you'll see there's higher amounts of chlorophyll here in these estuaries and bays coming in from the ocean. And then also what's interesting to note, the satellite imagery is picking up quite a bit of phytoplankton of chlorophyll A just south of Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard here. So this is an interesting sign when we think of another trigger of food abundance. The striped bass will be heading up along the coast to an area that has quite a bit of food. And that is why we start to see in the spring this migration and striped bass showing up around Martha's Vineyard and off the shores of Massachusetts. So now I'd like you to answer these final 2 questions for today's lesson. Why do striped bass migrate? And then finally, how do you think climate change? And when I say climate change, let's really think about changes in water temperature. How will climate change affect striped bass migration? And you can come up with quite a few different answers for that one because it will affect that migration in many ways. But what do you think? How do you think climate change will affect striped bass migration? So take some time to answer those questions. And I just want to say thank you so much for joining me today for our lesson on fish migration and taking a closer look at striped bass. So hopefully you can get outside on a nice sunny day and see if you can see any of the smaller bait fish that are around, herring, menhaden. Do you see some striped bass coming back? So thank you again for joining me today for this lesson on fish migration. You can find other lessons and online activities at thetrustees.org/at-home. So the Trustees is a nonprofit organization. This means we rely on people just like you and your family and friends in order to support us. I encourage you to become a member of the Trustees or renew your membership or donate at this time. And you can do so by simply going to thetrustees.org/join us. Thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you next time.